Hello, this is Ruban from the Property Investors blog, and I'm here speaking with David Bond, who is the head of PRS and Build to Rent at PRSim, which is a data consultancy and operational management solutions firm. So let's get straight into it. David, thanks very much for taking the time out to speak with us.
You're welcome.
Can you tell us a little bit about the work that PRSim does in the private rented sector?
Yes, certainly. PRSim is a full range of services across the private renting sector and the build-to-rent sector. We deal with operational management, so the management of built-to-rent blocks, and we also deal with the data, what we term data and advisory, so the viability reporting, and this is really where the survey comes in. It's a sector which is desperate for data and information, and the survey, as one example, is our clients and the sector really trying to understand what UK renters are looking for, what the demographic groups are. So when you're looking at either acquiring, building a block, a key element is to understand who's going to rent it and where they're coming from. So we provide the service from data and advisory, viability reporting, all the way through then to the operational management of the block.
Oh, that's interesting. And in terms of how the data is collected and your methodology and sample size, can you talk a little bit through that for us?
Yeah, certainly. As a group, LSL across the country under its varying brands, we have over 55,000 tenants in the private rented sector, and what became really clear and the benefit to the private rented and the build-to-rent sector was that we had the ability to go and access those tenants to find out what they believe. So every year we carry out the survey. It goes right the way across the primary brands, such as Your Move and Reed's Rains, and that's right across the UK. This year we had a sample response of 3,752 tenants who provided us with their views on a number of preset questions. What we also do beforehand is we speak to key players in the sector to find out what are the questions that the industry is looking for, so that we can really try and tailor the questions to what the sector is looking for. So you'll see in the survey there's a slant towards build to rent, because that's an area where we really want to try and understand a bit more information. And then this year, as well as doing the survey, we also then carried out across the four demographic groups some qualitative interviews. So we actually spoke to people. So you'll see in the survey, at the back of it, we give an example of our four demographic groups, and we name them, and they're real people that we've spoken to, where we could ask them the questions and maybe get a little bit more information than you might get from a simple survey.
Right, interesting. And of the 3,752 renters you spoke to, what kind of demographics, or is it kind of across the board you spoke to? Was it young people,
Well, and it's interesting because the one good thing is when we look at the response to the survey, and we look at our four demographic groups, which are younger independents, as we call them, flexible professionals, budgeting families, and then reconciled with renting, who are the older group, it's a pretty even split, 22, 26, 29 and 23%. So what is good is that we're getting a good cross-section of that demographic group, and what we're also seeing is that the private renting sector is made up of that wide group of that wide demographic group. It's not all about millennials, or it's not all about old renters.
And gives you a good sample size.
It gives us a great sample size. Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent, that's great. And are all these tenants that you're surveying and speaking to, are they all in employment, or are you talking to people that are claiming housing benefit and that kind of thing as well?
The majority of them will be employment. I don't have a specific breakdown, but the majority will be, as in they're operating in that private rented sector and not in that social housing.
And in terms of the key life stage groups that you identify, you've got the four, as you mentioned, the young independents, the flexible professionals, budgeting families, and reconciled with renting. Perhaps we can talk through each of them separately. Younger independents, what was your general findings from this year's survey, and how did it differ to perhaps the 2016 and 2017 reports that you did?
The thing that we found, and for us younger independents, you'll see we're aging sort of 18 to 24, so that's our younger independent renters. One of the things we see there, that a quarter of those are sharing, so we see a larger proportion of sharers in that younger group, and in fairness that's probably been quite consistent. This year we saw 15% of those having children, and that again hasn't moved quite dramatically. In fairness, it's a demographic group where if we look over the previous years, it's probably stayed quite consistent. If I look back to 2017, we were looking at about half that were sharing. So if there was a bit of a movement there, we're probably seeing a few less sharers. So that group is more transient. So again, when we look at length of tenancy, it's much shorter in this group. And when we've asked questions in the past around the desired length of tenancy, it's our younger group that are really looking at 12 months tenancy, and it's our families and our older groups that are probably more driven by a longer security of tenure at 2 and 3 years. So that's where we see it in that group. When we get to, and this year we made a slight change. In the past we've looked at what we call moving up and then struggling savers. We've broken the 25 to 44 group into two, because what we found is that they actually do split quite significantly into what we call budgeting families and then flexible professionals. And the budgeting families are, no surprise, they're those people with children. They may be making a move between property, so renting may not be as long-term for them. They are more focused on cost of living. So no surprise, you've got stalling and transportation and everything else. And they may be people who, again, have got an aspiration to own in the future. What we found when we split it with our flexible professionals, these quite often were couples and maybe less married, but living together.
Cohabiting,
Cohabiting. And those both with two jobs. So quite often we'll see the budgeting families may have one person generating the income, and then a housewife or house husband.
Right.
In our flexible professionals, we tended to see both of them as being income producers, so they are more likely to have disposable income.
Right.
So when we look at other areas and where people might spend their money, our flexible professionals have probably got more income to spend on life-affecting issues, like they may be getting in a cleaner. And when we look at build-to-rent specifically, they may be the people that would look to spend on a gym or something of that nature.
And the model will apply a little bit more to them, build-to-let. It's a bit more catered to kind of...
Yes, it is, because you're absolutely right. It's got that amenity space. It's got some of the draw which your flexible professional would pay for, and some of the schemes may have, for instance, like workout areas or gyms or home working areas, which are quite attractive to flexible
absolutely,
When we got to, and we've stayed with the reconciled with renting, this is an area which probably has changed. A few years ago, in 2016, when we looked at this area, was the time when there was a bit of a belief that only millennials rented property. And
I guess that's the kind of stereotype that build-to-rent has at the moment, right?
Well, and it's changing. I mean, there was a stereotype that, it's millennials that rent. And what our survey clearly shows, and every year has confirmed it, is that actually it isn't. It's right across that demographic group. So our reconciled renters are 45. They may be people that have got changing in circumstances. And this is a group where we see more of them renting alone. So we've given the pro for the other demographics, so we've got more of them are renting alone, and quite often they may have been downsizing. Children have left home. They are focused again on and some of those will be able to focus on then living, so whether that's socialising, a bit more focus on their lifestyle. A number of them may not at that point be working. So, and we see that as a growing demographic, not just in our survey, but I think a growing demographic across the rental sector.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, the fact that these reports are being produced are a result of, I know it gets bandied around quite a lot, the term kind of generation rent and, more people rent. Do you think that it's becoming a little bit more prevalent? I mean, is the UK going to turn into a nation of renters, particularly as there are clearer signs of a home ownership affordability crisis?
Yeah, I think if we look at the data out there, we're now about 21% of the UK population rents in the private rental sector, and the projection is that over the next few years that will rise to 25%. So I think we're definitely seeing an increase in people living in the private rented sector, and what we're seeing is that increase is across that demographic group. It's not just millennials. So yes, I think the private rented sector is an area where people are seeing that as either a tenure of choice or somewhere where maybe they are spending longer. So even in our surveys, we see people with a high aspiration to own. There is an acceptance that they will probably be in the rental sector for a period of time before that happens.
And do you think they're reluctant to be in that position? I get the impression a lot of kind of perhaps people in their late 20s, in their 30s, who would love to get on the housing ladder but can't, are kind of forced to rent. So it's not forced to rent, but they kind of feel like they're obliged to rent to be able to live independently. Most people don't want to live with their folks, in their 20s and 30s, really, do they?
No, and there's definitely an element of the group there who are renting because they can't afford to buy. We see a number of people in our previous survey, what we called our struggling savers. They are looking to save to ultimately buy a property, and they would prefer to be in that position where they could purchase property, but at the moment they're unable to, so they rent. So definitely there will be people who are renting probably through necessity rather than choice, but quite clearly there are other groups where renting becomes a choice and it suits their lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was quite interesting to see a comment made by Alistair Carmichael at GVA in your report, moving towards the idea of rent to buy, just kind of a blended ownership model, so to speak. Is there a growing interest in that, or where do you see that kind of sector of the market moving?
Yeah, and that I have to be honest, that was a comment from Alistair, and his position there was as head of finance and PRS at GVA. I think it is something which is now happening. In terms of where that goes and how that explores, not something I'm knowledgeable of.
Yeah, it's still quite a niche sector.
It's quite
right?
niche, but quite clearly it's something which is being considered by investors.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about affordability. I've done some basic research into, particularly London, which is a heavy build-to-rent area. The rents seem to be going up quite a lot, and I know EG did some research which pointed to the build-to-rent developments being 6.9% over local averages. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on this question of affordability. And, we talk about things like, the affordability crisis and young people being able to save for their deposit. But if they're spending a lot of their money on rents, where do you think that, how is that issue going to be resolved kind of moving forward? Because developers obviously don't have much of a choice because they're working to, high land costs and that kind of thing. And obviously builder costs are going up. So where do you see things moving in that direction? Is it going to be a very frustrated market where a lot of people are forced to rent moving forward rather than being able to save for deposits?
Well, it's interesting, and in the survey you'll see that at the moment an average mortgage is around 29% of people's household income, and rent is at around 31% on average. Now, as you go around different parts of the country, that will change, and if you go to London, then people will be clearly paying more than 31% of their income on the rent. I think there is a very clear focus on making rents affordable, and everyone is doing that. There are clearly, and you'll be aware of, build-to-rent developments which are more, what you might want to call more niche, and they are clearly renting above market rent. But overall, people are working to try and are very aware of trying to keep that rental spend in an area where people can afford it. So in that sort of early 30, I think is pretty much where it will be.
Right, okay. And yeah, I mean, I guess there are quotas as well for build-to-rent developers to meet in terms of the amount of units they deliver which are genuinely affordable.
Affordable, yes.
Sorry, I was also going to mention that there are developers that are specifically focusing on affordable units as well, such as Sigma. I know they've kind of got an affordable housing model for the rental space as well, so which is quite interesting. So yeah, I guess was there any other kind of interesting features of this year's report that you wanted to kind of bring up?
There was a couple. So one of the ones that's been quite key is around barriers to entry. So the government, as you'll be aware, have stepped in and said we're going to ban tenant fees to make entry to renting more cost effective for renters. One of the things that's also happening, and we were asking very specifically the question in the survey, was around this move towards replacement deposit schemes.
Right.
So one of those costs that the tenant has to incur is security deposit scheme. So that in England at the moment will be just over £1,000 on average. And again, dependent on where you go in the country, that will potentially go up. There are a number of tenancy replacement deposit schemes out there now. So we were very keen to ask the question of how influential would that be in your decision to rent? And what we found that 7 in 10 people said that definitely would be influential in their decision to rent. But what also came out was that people saying, but I'd really need to understand and see the transparency of the scheme.
Yeah, it's quite a new area, so a lot of people would be a little bit wary about it.
And people didn't want to get to the point where they thought it looked good at the front end, but ultimately I'm sort of paying at the back. So what was clear on that was, and you're right, it's new, and we're seeing a growing number of schemes coming to the market. What we did see is that if people can understand them, they don't believe that there's any hidden cost, then yes, the idea of being able to rent without having to effectively lock away thousands of pounds was very positively received.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. And yeah, so another feature of the report that I'm looking at now was how kind of fostering strong dialogue with tenants is quite an important consideration as well. And I was going to ask you about, because a lot of people that read our blog and use our services tend to be kind of smaller landlords, kind of 1-2 house owning, property owning landlords. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on these types of landlords in the market moving forward, where you'd see their role in the PRS sector moving forward.
I think when we look at what comes out of the survey, I think this is relevant to all landlords, whether you're a small landlord or you're an institutional landlord. So when you mentioned about communication, so the communication is when we ask and consistently when we ask tenants what is important to them, we'll find the condition of the building, obviously the value for money in terms of rent, the quality of the landlord, and communication. And I think that is true of every landlord. So how you deal with the communication is clearly really important. I think one of the things the survey also calls out, which again I think is relevant to all landlords, are some of the things that tenants maybe would pay more for. So you'll see in the survey things like Wi-Fi, the ability to have a pet, to be allowed to have a pet, satellite cable TV. So some of those will be very much geared towards the build-to-rent apartment blocks. But some of those are really still relevant to the small landlord market. So I think communication is key. What it tells us is, first and foremost, ensure that your property is in good condition. So that's really important. And the communication bit is really understanding what tenants are looking for, what the tenants want. And then if you are in the position to look at some of those additional services which may generate additional income, then I think that's something which landlords right across the spectrum should be looking at.
And I guess there's a place for smaller landlords, perhaps for those that are reconciled with renting, because I've noticed that, that type of demographic typically are looking for the properties that might have kind of larger gardens and that kind of thing, and perhaps a little bit different to the build-to-rent model,
yes,
as it currently stands anyway.
Absolutely. I think there is a very clear market. So not in its horses for courses. Not everybody wants to live in a built-to-rent apartment, and that is quite clear, as you rightly point out. And when we look at particularly whether it's reconciled renting or in families, that typical housing stock, which is in the current private renting sector, is exactly what people want.
Right.
So there's very much a place for that, without a shadow of a doubt. And I think we will always see the market where we have different service offering and different people for different products.
Yeah.
But undoubtedly, the typical housing stock is in demand and will always be in demand.
Oh, that's interesting. That's good to know. I'm sure it'll be good to hear that for a lot of people listening in, for sure. But yeah, that's great. I think I've got some... those are great answers there, and I really appreciate you taking the time out to speak with us today. And I wish you all the best, and I look forward to the future reports.
Thank you very much indeed.